Welcome to your last session of the 2015 Student Leadership Conference. My name is Mason Margada, and I am an ambassador on behalf of the 2015 SLC Planning Committee. I hope you, woohoo, yeah, all right. I hope you have enjoyed your day so far, and that you are excited to find what your next steps may be. You are gathered in this room to listen to an inspiring presentation by an amazing leader. One who will help guide you to find your next steps. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Mary Kitagawa. Ms. Kitagawa has been a human rights activist for over 25 years, helping 76 Japanese Canadians who were exiled in 1942 after the Pacific War began receive their honorary degrees from UBC. Mrs. Kitagawa will be doing a 40-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute question and answer period. Please give me a big round of applause for Mrs. Kitagawa.
Wow, that's so nice to see all of you here. So many still coming in. Okay, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here to give me this opportunity to tell you a little bit about events that relating to the Japanese Canadians. The main topic is about the 1942 students who were expelled from this campus after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December the 7th, 1941. And that started the Pacific War. In order for you to understand why this happened, I must tell you a short summary of the history of the Japanese and other people of Asian descent in Canada, especially in British Columbia. The racialization and discrimination against Asians did not begin when Canada entered World War II. It began in 1871 when BC joined Confederation. One of the first acts of the BC legislature was to disenfranchise Indians and Chinese. In 1895, BC passed an amendment to the Provincial Elections Act, which stated, no Chinaman, Japanese, or Indian shall have his name placed on the register of voters for any electoral district or be entitled to vote in any election. This act denied all people who were non-white to practice in any of the professions, such as law, medicine, accounting, nursing, engineering, and the likes. One had to be on the voters list in order to be allowed to work in the professions. The non-whites were doomed to work in only 4 of the primary industries, and they were farming, fishing, mining, and logging. Graduating at the top of the class from UBC would not have allowed you to practice in the profession that you were trained in. Several hundred orders and councils were passed in an effort to curtail the successes of the Asians. Beginning in 1938, the RCMP was keeping a surveillance on the Japanese Canadians in their communities. In 1940, they reported that they found no subversive activities in any of them. However, between May and August of 1941, with the passing of Order in Council PC 117, called the Oriental Registration, the RCMP began registering all people of Japanese descent over the age of 16 years. They were going to register the Chinese next, and the Indians after that. The ID cards were issued, which had to be carried at all times. Failure to show these cards to the RCMP or any police meant that you could be jailed for 6 months. Similar to the apartheid card that the Africans had to carry. This was 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The government knew where every Japanese-Canadian family lived in British Columbia. When Canada joined the Pacific War, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King invoked the all-powerful War Measures Act without going through Parliament. This enabled the government to act without discussion or debate. The result was lightning swift in her decision to remove all people of the Japanese race from BC, regardless of whether the person was born in Canada or was a citizen. The military and the RCMP tried to convince the Prime Minister that the Japanese Canadians posed no threat to the security of Canada and should not be removed from their homes. However, countless orders in council were passed, and 22,000 innocent, hardworking, loyal citizens of BC were removed from the BC coast. The motto at that time for the BC politicians was, "No Japs from the Rockies to the sea." Something like ethnic cleansing, I think. One such politician was Howard Charles Green. When I read in the Vancouver Sun of September the 13th, 2006, that a tall federal building on 401 Broad Street in Vancouver was named after him, I couldn't accept that. I immediately let the government know that it was an unacceptable choice. I asked, "How can you apologize to us in 1988 for the injustices done to us, and in 2006 honor one of the architects of hate that spearheaded the expulsion of Japanese Canadians?" It took about a year for my committee and the community to convince the federal government to relent and change the building's name to honor Douglas Jung. He was the first Chinese Canadian member of Parliament in Canada. On May 17, 1942, when I was a 7-year-old child, I watched an RCMP officer manhandle my father like a common criminal and literally throw him into the back of a pickup truck. I saw the gun on the officer's holster, which made me very fearful that our father was being taken away to be shot. As he disappeared into a void, my mother and her 5 children awaited our fate. 1 month later, we, together with 77 other Japanese Canadians residing on Salt Spring Island, were taken to the agricultural barns of Hastings Park to replace the animals which were housed there shortly before. In this degrading living quarter, we were sorted like cattle to be sent to sugar beet farms on the prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, to work as slave laborers, and to prisoner of war camp in Angler, Ontario. What you see there is a shirt that these prisoners wore, Japanese Canadian prisoners wore, so that the soldiers on the high towers had a target to shoot at if they tried to escape. And also to the work camps, the men were separated from the their families. And these men were sent to the work camps to build highways from Yellowhead Pass in Alberta to Blue River in BC. And we were also hastily sent to hastily constructed shacks, which were usually only about 14 by 28, divided into three segments. Every place that the Japanese Canadians were sent, the living conditions were brutal. Some people had to live in granaries and chicken coops and anything that had four walls. Beginning in the barn where the women and children had to live in cattle stalls, where maggots were still crawling through the floorboards, where unpalatable food was served on tin plates in the poultry section of the barn, where diarrhea and food poisoning was rampant, and the lack of privacy among strangers was very challenging. Our hair, skin, and clothes were permeated with the smell of urine and feces left behind by the former four-legged occupants. The 76 Japanese Canadian UBC students were swept away from this campus during that time. They never would have acknowledged or be identified if I didn't accidentally see an unusual graduation ceremony at the University of Washington on a website. The graduates were very elderly. All were wearing cap and gowns and smiling broadly. I immediately emailed one of the speakers of the ceremony, who was a Japanese-American professor of ethnic studies at the universities. Dr. Kashima informed me that all public universities along the Pacific coast were doing the same to honor Japanese-American students who were sent away in 1942, when President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6099. They were part of the 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent that were sent to concentration camps, scattered outside of the exclusion zone. I wanted to know how that ceremony was made possible. He told me that once the university officials learned about these students, they immediately agreed to honor them. Hoping the same from UBC, I wrote to Dr. Stephen Tuke, President and Vice Chancellor of University of BC in April of 2008. I asked if UBC was willing to do the same. A discouraging reply came, but not from Dr. Tuke, but from the chair of the Senate Tributes Committee. Dr. Sally Thorne informed me that unlike the universities south of the border, UBC did not expel her students of Japanese descent. As a result, she continued, UBC will not be granting honorary degrees to this small subset of people attached by political and social decisions of that time. She also stated that staff and faculty of Japanese heritage left UBC for many reasons. When I read those words, I knew she did not know our history. Japanese Canadians could not have been on staff or on faculty because of the amendment to the BC's Election Act. At this time, I realized that I needed a plan of action. What I needed to do was to educate these people who will be making the decision whether to honor the Japanese Canadian students or not. I was determined never to give up until I got the results that I wanted. It was imperative that these people understood the historical truth about our experience. In order to educate these decision makers, I sent a list of books about Japanese Canadian history and links to all of the U.S. universities giving ceremonies to their former students. It was my wish that they would do some research to understand what I was seeking. I later learned from one of the members of the UBC Senate that most of the people at the table felt that it was too late to do anything about it because it happened so long ago. Many years ago, William Faulkner, a writer, said, "The past is never dead and buried. It isn't even past." For me, until UBC acknowledged her culpability in the expulsion of the Japanese Canadian students in 1942, this issue was not going to die on the Tributes Committee table. UBC did not support her Japanese Canadian students. However, there were two professors who did speak out strongly for the students who were in their classes: economics professor Henry Angus and commerce professor E.H. Morrill. When their protestation could not keep their students at UBC, they helped them complete their year by correspondence at another institution outside of British Columbia. Professor Morrill kept in contact with all of his Japanese Canadian boys, he called them, throughout the war years, encouraging them to keep up their spirit and continue to face the challenges bravely. When the Eastern universities stopped borrowing Japanese Canadians in the late 1940s, he wrote letters of support for his boys to enable them to be accepted. In Ken Adachi's book, The Enemy That Never Was, it is stated that McGill University barred Japanese Canadian students on the frank contention that serfs of an inferior race deserve no education. Dr. Elaine Bernard, while studying for her master's degree at the University of Alberta in 1977, wrote a paper called A University at War, Japanese Canadians at UBC during World War II. She stated that there were 49 male Japanese Canadian students registered in the Canadian Officers Training Corps, which is the COTC. In January of 1942, a few weeks after the start of the Pacific War, they were summarily dismissed by the Senate Committee on Military Education. These senior administrators sided with the racist voices screaming outside the gates of UBC and pushed the students out. They were President Ellis Klink, I think he has a building named after him on campus, Chancellor R.E. McKechnie, Dean J.N. Finlayson, Mr. B. Wood, Mr. Edward McBride, and Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Shrum. This was an example of moral failure, of leadership at the university that made scapegoats of these innocent students. The students were shocked and devastated that their university, a symbol of truth and enlightenment, had bowed to the pressure of hostilities and racism boiling outside of their campus. Since Canada was their country of birth, they always thought of themselves only as Canadians. They wondered what their crime was, since they were never charged, they were never allowed to question the decision. Shortly after, according to Adachi, a dean of women gathered all the Japanese Canadian women students together and told them that UBC will not be assisting them to remain in Vancouver to continue their education. there was quite a difference in how the administration of the UBC, United States universities, reacted to the expulsion of their Japanese American students. All the presidents and members of the faculties protested loudly to the U.S. government the inclusion of their students in Executive Order 6099. When that effort failed, the presidents of the universities sent their faculty members to the concentration camps to help their students write their final exams so that they could either graduate or get credit for the year they were in. Arrangements were made for many students to register at universities outside of the exclusion zone of the 3 coastal states. The graduation ceremony that I watched in 2008 on the website were made possible because the U.S. state government stepped in, thinking that BC government could do the same for the 1942 UBC students. I wrote to the then Minister of Advanced Education, Naomi Yamamoto. Her reply was very disappointing. She informed me that the government does not interfere with UBC affairs. Next, I wrote to Michelle Mungo, NDP critic for the advanced education. She found out that the Senate had appointed a task force to look into the matter. However, I was not informed of the progress they were making, if any. The biggest disappointment came when I received a hard copy letter in February of 2010 from the chair asking me to keep the issue confidential. I thought to myself, why and what for? No, I was not going to keep it confidential. She informed me that the Tributes Committee was working with our Japanese Canadian community to resolve the issue. However, since I knew all the committees in our community, I phoned all of them and was told that none have been contacted by UBC. At that time, I knew I had to put more pressure on the decision makers, so I began a letter writing campaign to flood the emails and letterboxes of the President and the Senate Tributes Committee. When I received no reaction for all the letters that they received, I began a petition which brought hundreds of names from across Canada and some from overseas. I was no longer a lone voice. A large chorus was beginning to form, and I felt the euphoria of not standing alone. The next step was to clearly explain what my journey was to this point and to ask for more support. I wrote an article in the Nikkei Voice, a Japanese Canadian publication originating in Toronto, to inform the community about the forgotten UBC students whose education was stolen from them in 1942. In the article, I explained how the Japanese American students were being honored beginning in 2008. I also wrote another article for the Greater Vancouver Japanese Canadian Citizens Association Bulletin with the same message. What amazed me was that I began receiving emails and letters from some of the actual surviving students and relatives of those who had already died. They were elated to learn that their story of expulsion and suffering was finally being given a voice and brought to the surface from their silent graves. The student newspaper, the UBC, contacted me for several interviews and began writing many articles of advocacy about what happened to the 1942 students. The editor and the reporters who kept our issue in many of the publications understood the rightness of our cause and supported us fully. Unfortunately, the Senate Tributes Committee did not seem to be moved. I needed to let UBC know that they needed to communicate with me. In order to generate some response, I decided to go to the mainstream community and the media. I contacted Patricia Graham, who was the editor-in-chief of the Vancouver Sun. In 2010, I met her at a women's conference in Victoria, where I was one of the speakers. In August of 2011, I discussed my quest with her, and she told me that it was a newsworthy item and agreed to have it published. A half-page article written by her reporter, Jerry Bellett, appeared in the Vancouver Sun on August the 22nd, 2011. From that one article, I began receiving requests for interviews from all the major newspapers across Canada, radio stations, and even TV station, Al Jazeera. I was very happy that this topic was now in the public domain, and UBC reacted. On October the 5th, 2011, I finally received an update from the President's office on the process by which UBC was determining how to honor the students whose education was disrupted in 1942. He informed me that the task force struck by the Senate Tributes Committee in 2010 was in the final stages of working out the detail of the three-pronged process plan that included providing personal recognition of the students, initiatives to educate future UBC students about the dark episode, and for UBC Library to preserve and bring to life the historical records. When a request came from the President's office for the list of the 1942 students, which I had, I felt that a decision must be near at hand. There was an agenda posted on the UBC Senate website for November the 16th, 2011 meeting. The last item to be voted on stated honorary degrees for the 1942 Japanese Canadian students. The next morning, I received an email from the President's office informing me through a media release that what I was seeking had finally come to pass. It was a hallelujah moment for me after over three long years of struggle. I phoned many of the former students whose phone number I had, and to tell them the good news. Most could not believe that it actually happened, but was elated with the news. They told me that they never dreamed that such an event would ever happen in their lifetime. Remember, these students who were alive were now 89 to 95. The news that they will be graduating from UBC at long last brought them great joy and a feeling of anticipation of the planned event. The President could not have chosen a more capable duo to chair the Tributes Committee to plan the congregation. Shirley Nakata, your UBC Ombudsperson for Students, and Alden Habakon, Director of Intercultural Understanding Strategy. They were strongly assisted by Dr. Henry Yu, Associate Professor of History and Principal of St. John's College. They chose a team of dedicated people to plan the event. My husband Tosh and I were asked to be on the committee to find the students or their relatives. At the beginning, it felt like looking for a needle in a haystack. Where do you start? We all had a daunting task because everyone also had their regular jobs at UBC. Time was critical since we only had 5 months to bring this about. Beginning on the 2nd of 2012, my husband was on the phone and emails every day, starting at 6 a.m. for 5 months, looking for the 76 students or their relatives. We were fortunate to have Chris Eaton, Associate Registrar and Director of the Senate, to help us. He went into the archives and the Totem yearbooks to verify the names of the students. The editor of the Nikkei Voice, Mika Fukuma, her help was crucial for making connections in Eastern Canada. In the end, the most memorable and emotional ceremony was held at the Chan Center. I felt that it was a ceremony of redemption for UBC. I have nothing but gratitude for the total commitment UBC extended to making sure that the congregation was extra special. I thank all those who were on the Tributes Committee who sacrificed so much to make the ceremony so perfect. Perhaps if UBC had reacted to my quest like the universities in Washington, Oregon, and California, many of the students would still have been alive. We lost 2 students 3 months before congregation and another who lived in Richmond just 13 days before congregation. But luckily, they knew that they were being honored. By delaying it, UBC received many negative media attention. However, that delay allowed me to keep the history of the Japanese Canadians in the media for 4 years. This helped to educate more Canadians about the history that Canada wanted to hide. Nothing was written about the internment until Ken Adachi wrote his book. For the students, after 70 long years, they were finally being acknowledged and welcomed back as alumni. By making this decision, UBC restored the bond that was severed between her and the 1942 Japanese Canadian students. The new Asian Canadian and Asian Migration minor course launched in September of 2014 at UBC will educate future students about the contributions the Asians have made for the betterment of Canada and the historical injustices that they suffered. In order to truly understand the truth, one must know the names, see the faces, hear their voices, and feel the emotion of the victim. They convey the message that no history book can. Now we have an opportunity to record and teach the truth in print, in lectures, and on film. This is our history. Tragic, but triumphant. Let us help UBC to make good on her promise, as stated by former President Stephen Tu, and I quote, "As a university, we aim to create a more compassionate and thoughtful environment where students, faculty, and staff can act as global citizens. We can do this by recognizing injustice and taking steps to learn from it." In September of 2013, during my visit to Toronto, I had the pleasure of gathering some of the students who were unable to attend the congregation due to health issues. It was a happy, rewarding occasion to finally meet these students. Now I'm going to show you a short clip of one of the students. She and her sister Ruth this is Ruth on this side, and Mary's on the other side. They were UBC students. Before I tell you this, Mary phoned me on New Year's Day. So I asked her how she was. And she said, "My mind is very sharp, but my body has turned into a turtle." So anyway, I think she's 93 now. So would you like to show the clip?
You know, everything happened on December 7th. Everything is related to December 7th for me. When the two RCN officers came to my door and asked for my father, they wanted to speak to him. When my father came, the two men said, "Mr. Nagala, we would like you to come with us. We would like to ask you just a few questions." I wanted to know why. What were the reasons for him to go? Where was he going? When was he coming back? Why couldn't they ask the questions there? You know, they answered nothing. But that moment is something that I had closed for a long, long time. I was not able to talk about it, but I can now. Because I had to understand what happened to me at that time. When I saw my father, Mark, taken away between two police officers, to take a man who was respectable. I love my father so much. Honest, hardworking, and knew the Canadian ways. And then here is a man being whisked away without any question. I was afraid. I was supposed to be respectful. I was supposed to understand this is the Canadian way where you're allowed to be questioned. And then at that moment, I could see my mother crying, wondering, and then my stomach was so upside down. I was anxious, frightened. I couldn't say I was angry. There was no room for me to be angry. I didn't have time to be angry because what behind me. After that, I did not go to UBC. I had a job at home to do. I had to find my father. So university for me ended. University of British Columbia, and that tore my mother's heart, really. She thought that our education was finished, but then with her spirit, no, she wasn't letting us think that. We must proceed. We either had to, my mother's decision was to take the family and go as the others to Hastings Park and to wherever development they were going to stay. My mother was not going to do that. My mother wanted us to go to school. She wanted us to wanted me to find a place where my brothers and sisters could go to school. And I really, as I speak now, I can't thank I can't thank my mother ever. If she could hear me today, I would say, if it wasn't for her toughness, her dedication, none of us would be here today. She had a purpose in her life, and she gave that purpose to us. Never mind, Shionanai, proceed, and we did. And when I was in the train, there were moments that I guess that's why I closed the whole incident on December 7th for me. Because in the train I thought, this is not right. This is not Canada. This is not what I'm learning. It's not right. But then things happen, right? Things happen. We must accept it, show manai, and proceed. And with that courage, I guess that's what kept me going to today. Till today. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But I can't forget my father. For the first time, I'm able to see my father again walking away, and my mother. Because when my father came home, he was not the same. No, he never had the same. But you see from his eyes, you know? No. They changed him.
Are you okay to answer some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions that they would like Ms. Kitagawa to answer, you can ask those now and she can answer those for you. We can give her a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. You have a question?
Yeah.
Oh.
First off, thank you so much for sharing that story. That was an incredible story.
You're welcome.
I guess the only question that can come to my mind is, how did you manage to just deal with what must be some kind of anger or resentment that might have boiled up over the years? Was there a way you managed to keep that at bay and stay focused on the task at hand?
Well, I come from a family where the word forgiveness was used a lot. My parents always taught us that through forgiveness you can proceed, like Mary said. And so the word bitterness was never part of our vocabulary. And that's how we progressed and succeeded. Yes. Yes.
You said that forgiveness was built into your family. Is that indicative of Japanese culture of that generation?
I don't know too much about Japanese culture because, I was born in Canada and my mother was born in Canada. And so only through my father, which I often had to have my mother translate for me. So I really don't know if forgiveness is part of that culture, if that's what you're asking.
I guess it was just in the conversations that you had with the students that finally got to graduate, did you find that those students were able to create forgiveness themselves and find that repose?
Oh yes, it's through forgiveness that they were able to go ahead and be as successful as they were. Most of the students, except for a few women students who either got married or didn't have enough funds, because what the government did to us was freeze our bank account, and they stole our property and houses and fishing boats, whatever, and they did not give the money to us. and they sold all our property at about a quarter of the value, and then they put it into our bank account, which they controlled, and they just doled out a little bit for us to survive on. And in that way, we paid for our own imprisonment. Yes. Yes?
Other than trying to make the community aware of the issues of the past with the Japanese Canadians, what other work do you do within the Japanese Canadian community?
Other things? I don't know if I could start listing them. Mason said, I was with the Human Rights Committee, Japanese Human Rights Committee, for 25 years, and in that time we did just countless amount of advocacy for not just the Japanese Canadian community, but for the First Nations and Chinese Canadian community for the head tax, Indo-Canadian community for the Komogata Maru, and things like that. Yeah, so it wasn't, concentrating just on Japanese Canadians. Yes?
Madam, which advice do you have for us, UBC students, so that we can help to build an inclusive community in the future and to ensure that such events do not happen again?
Well, if you look at everyone as a person and not judge them on the color or where they came from, and if you could just get along, without judging, then I think you will do very well.
That's actually perfect timing. Let's give Ms. Katagawa one more big round. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the session.